Of all the places to find a reference to the Canadian efforts in the First World War, Boston Common and a Christmas tree may not be the thing that you first think of. By December of 1917, with the United States having already entered the war and with German submarines hunting shipping along the northern Atlantic, the town of Halifax was encountering quite a boom of activity. It was the assembly point for Allied convoys and often played host to a wide variety of international vessels carrying men and supplies for the war effort. Halifax was also the point of entry for ships uninvolved in the conflict, as all neutral vessels attempting to do business of some sort or other in North America were first subjected to inspection there. With a population of only around 60,000, it was a site of immense importance to the Allied war effort, and specifically to Canada's own contributions in men, supplies, and labour. But on the morning of the 6th, disaster struck as the Norwegian steamship Imo collided with the French ship Mont-Blanc. The Norwegian ship was a neutral vessel on its way to New York to pick up relief supplies for Belgium, and at the time was only carrying ballast. The Mont-Blanc was carrying 200 tons of TNT, 2,300 tons of the explosive picric acid, and 10 tons of gun cotton, and with barrels of fuel being carried high on her deck. The Imo had been scheduled to depart Halifax the day before, but a delay in its refueling of coal meant that the port's submarine nets had to be raised before the ship could leave. To make up for the lost time the following morning, she was rushing well above the approved speed of 5 knots through the Narrows to leave the harbour. Simultaneously, the Mont-Blanc was also moving into the harbour, having faced its own delays the day earlier. The captain of the Mont-Blanc first sighted the Imo from about 3/4 of a mile away, and saw that not only was she moving at a dangerous speed, but that her present course would have her rake the Mont-Blanc's bow. The Mont-Blanc sounded its whistle once to signal the Imo to change its course, but the Imo responded with 2 notes, signaling that she would not be changing course. The Imo had already been forced to maneuver around another ship's course when it refused to divert that morning, and it seemed to hold little intent on wasting any further time. The Mont-Blanc slowed her engines and began to turn away and closer to the shore, again sounding a warning for the Imo to change course. But again, 2 whistle blows was the reply. While the 2 ships continued to get dangerously close to one another, they both cut their engines entirely, but still they continued to drift. Soon enough, the bows of each ship was parallel with the other. In a final attempt to avoid a disastrous collision with both the Imo and the coastline, the Mont-Blanc twisted hard to port, or to the left. But at the same time, the Imo went to full reverse, signaling it with 3 blasts of her whistle. The Imo had already been proving difficult to steer that morning because she was not carrying any cargo, and so she was sitting very high up in the water, so high that her propeller and her rudder weren't actually fully submerged. To make matters even worse, she had a single right-hand propeller, meaning that when she was advancing, the ship would continually veer to the left unless she was corrected. And when she was pulled to the reverse, she veered to the right. And so when the captain of the Imo put her to full reverse, the bow of the ship swept across to the right and collided with the Mont-Blanc, attempting to steer out of the way. The time was 8:45 a.m. And while the actual collision itself didn't cause much damage, the jolt was enough to cause barrels of benzol fuel to fall and break open, flooding the deck of the Mont-Blanc with fuel, which then seeped down into its lower holds. And as the Imo pulled away from this collision, the scraping of the 2 ships against each other caused sparks to fall inside the Mont-Blanc's hull. Soon enough, the ship was aflame, and her captain was forced to give the order to abandon ship. Normally, any vessel carrying so deadly a cargo as the Mont-Blanc would be flying red flags to indicate the danger, but due to the threat of German submarines, there were no such signals being flown at that time. And so aside from the ship's crew, very few individuals actually knew about the Mont-Blanc's cargo, and the thick black smoke of the fuel made many people just assume it was another oil tanker fire. The crewless ship began to wash closer to shore, and soon enough it ran aground against a pier. Fire crews attempted to tackle the blaze, and preparations were being made to drag the ship away from shore. But at 9:04 a.m., when the fires finally reached Mont-Blanc's cargo, the ship exploded. The ship was immediately torn asunder, and the water around her vaporized as the heat of the blast reached a total 5,000 degrees Celsius. It even exposed the harbor floor, the blast was so extreme. A shock wave pushed outwards at 1,500 meters a second, and a cloud of smoke rose 2 miles into the sky. It's estimated that 1,600 people were killed in the initial explosion, many of whom had been gathering around their windows and at the docks to watch the fire, which was spectacular at that point, with a further 9,000 people being wounded, of whom another 300 or 400 would later die. Every building within a 1.5-mile radius was either destroyed or severely damaged, and metal shrapnel was landing in upwards of 3.5 miles away, and a tidal wave resulting from the blast flooded 3 whole blocks of the town and entirely wiped out a nearby settlement of Native Americans. A certain Mr. Percy Hardy, who had survived the blast while on board a minesweeper, described the absolute horror of the scene in a letter which he later wrote to friends. When I reached the dock, chunks of steel, all sizes, from a cent to a suitcase, came flying all around. I have the piece that nearly got me. It buried itself in the deck. I thought then that we were being bombarded. On seeing them all making for shelter, I started to run across the dockyard, and then I saw a man's head blown off, and houses tumbled down all around me, and still the lumps of red-hot steel were coming. Then gases and smoke. My one thought then was that the end of the world had come. I got to the gate, and the sentinels were either killed or injured, and I passed out and would judge in the 10 minutes the shock was over and the pieces had stopped flying. Everybody in the open was either killed or badly injured, and women then started to run out of houses with children all covered with blood. And to add to the horrors, fires then started around the part of the town where the ship went up. We've only here very briefly scraped the surface of just how horrific the Halifax explosion truly was. But in the end, that doesn't really answer our question, now does it? And that being, what on earth could this tragedy have to do with a bit of Christmas decoration in Boston? Well, when news of the explosion reached Boston, the city's mayor, James M. Curley, alongside the state's governor, Samuel Walker McCall, immediately sent to work in arranging for aid, with Curley stating that, quote, "The city of Boston has stood first in every movement of similar character since 1822, and will not be found wanting in this instance." Immediately, a train was loaded with medical supplies, with food, doctors, nurses, and aid workers to make the 700-mile journey to the so-called shattered city. To make matters for the city even worse, a blizzard had struck Halifax not long after the initial blast, which slowed aid coming into the city and disrupted the process of actually helping the wounded and uncovering the dead. It was only after fighting these intense snows, with some passengers even disembarking to help shovel snow out of the way, that the Boston train was able to arrive on the morning of the 8th. And it wasn't the only aid that Massachusetts sent either, as volunteers and supplies continued to be shipped up north via train and ship. It was these Bostonian aid workers which helped to build temporary housing for the now 30,000 plus people with either no or inadequate housing during the cold winter season. It was these aid workers who helped to staff hospitals and to distribute food aid to the suffering population. Even a great deal of financial aid came from the city, as out of the $30 million in total aid sent to the city of Halifax, which would be the equivalent to around $500 million today, a total of $750,000 came from Massachusetts alone. Indeed, $100,000 worth was raised in the course of a single hour at the relief rally which was held at Faneuil Hall in Boston. And so, unsurprisingly, many Bostonian doctors and nurses and aid workers all found themselves very far away from home for Christmas that year, and in a rather depressing and dismal environment. And so alongside the distributing of food, the administering of medical aid, and the construction of large temporary housing blocks, the Bostonians found themselves putting up Christmas trees and decorations to try and brighten the mood just that little bit. And indeed, this sacrifice on the part of the city of Boston was not forgotten, and the next year, the people of Halifax sought to show their gratitude to the people of Boston. And while they were still recovering from the terror of that blast, both emotionally and financially, they sent the American city a gift, a Christmas tree. And indeed, this memory was brought back in 1971 when it became a tradition. And since that year, every year, the Boston Christmas tree has been supplied by Halifax, and not at an insignificant cost, in memory of those Bostonian efforts to help alleviate their suffering 100 years ago in the midst of one of the most destructive wars in history, and in one of the most trying times the city of Halifax has ever faced. So it's a rather humbling story, and it just goes to show that not every death in the First World War happened to take place in the trenches, and not all suffering over there on the European continent. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants. Is it meant to look like art?